You're watching a lesson on implementing a group policy infrastructure. Now, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, this is really kind of like part 2 of a 3-part lesson grouping, all on group policy. Well, here I want to talk about the actual flow of processing of these group policy objects. So the first thing, before we go in and hop back over to the operating system and see how things actually work. Okay, so in order to see this in the actual operating system, once again, we are on NYDC1. Okay, this is our main domain controller for the globalmantics.local domain. I am going to go ahead and hit the start button on my keyboard to take me into the start screen, and then we're going to jump back into group policy management where we were playing around in a previous lesson. And there's a few things I want to show you here. The first thing is, let's go ahead and expand some of this out. Right, here's our forest and our domains. Got our globalmantics.local domain. Expand this out. We have our group policy objects. Remember, when we talk about LSDOU, we have our local group policy objects, so that's not even seen here. Okay, that's on the individual computer itself, getting applied first. The S in the LSDOU has to do with sites. Now, I don't have any sites set up in this environment, so there's no sites that we're going to have any group policy objects linked to. Then we have the D, right? LSD, D for domains. Here we have our domain, so here's the globalmantics.local domain. So it would be any group policy objects linked to that domain, and here we have the default domain policy being the only one linked there. And then we have our OUs. So an OU of domain controllers is one example. And then we have our default domain controllers policy that's linked there. Or we have another OU here of New York, and there's nothing linked there. And inside New York, we have other OUs, right? We have that demo GPO already linked. That was something that I created in a previous lesson, okay? And that's pretty much it if I expand this out. But I just wanted to show you, here's that OU structure. So that's the LSDOU as we see it here. And the number one thing, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that you just need to grasp the idea that I was just explaining to you about how these settings are like light switches that you're turning on and you're turning off, and whichever was the last one applied, well, that's the way the setting was left. Okay, it was left in either the on or the off position based upon who touched it last. And you just need to get that general idea. But here's the deal. If you need help with this, there's a few different things where you can get help. The first thing is, if I click on an actual policy itself, right? So I'm going to click on this default domain policy. If I click on the settings tab, here it will generate a report for me of all the various settings. See, in the old days, this was a lot trickier, because in the old days, you know what we had to do? I'd have to right click on the policy, go into edit, right? Get in here to the editor, and I'd have to start just digging down through all of this and just start clicking until I could see if there were any settings that were configured, right? So these all say not configured, not configured, not configured. And I would just keep clicking down through all of this until I'd find something that says it was configured. What a nightmare that is. Now, obviously, if I go to all settings, this is a much easier way to see if it's configured. And you can even do a query to now check and see if anything is configured. But I'll tell you what, rather than even mess around in the group policy object editor at all, let's close out of there. It creates a report for you right here. And if I click on show all, this is showing me just the settings that are configured. Okay, so this is basically the whole thing. This whole thing, it stops right there. There are no user configuration settings at all. So we can just scroll up past that. We don't care about that. These are all the settings. So the default domain policy does what? Looks like under Windows settings, well, first of all, under computer configuration, under policies, under Windows settings, under security settings, we have the account policies / password policies set, right? We have all these different password policies in place. We have the account lockout policies set. We have Kerberos policies set. Under local policies, security options, here's a few security options that are set on network access and network security. And public key policies, EFS, encrypting file system.
That's it. These are all the settings that have been set on that particular policy. And if I were to click on the default domain controllers policy and say show all on the settings tab, here are all the settings for our domain controllers. Again, nothing for users. It's all about the computers. So that's the first thing that can be used to help you out, in the sense that if you're not sure what a group policy object is doing, you can see the settings right there. But here's something that's even more cool than that. Down here we have group policy results and group policy modeling. Group policy results is something that's been around for quite a while, although it used to be in command line form only. And it used to simply be called GP results. Right? That was the, actually I don't think there was an S. I think it was just GP result. From a command line. You would literally go into a command line and you would run GP result. And you would get your results, again, in the command line. Wasn't very user-friendly, wasn't very easy to read the report. Now, with the implementation of this Group Policy Management Console, we now have the ability to have this in a graphic user interface. So if I right-click on Group Policy Results, because you'll notice everything is blank, if I right-click on it and go into the Group Policy Results wizard, I can now go through, let me click Next, and it's going to ask me, it's going to say, all right, what results do you want to see? Meaning, who logged in where that you want to see the results? Okay, so I could go ahead and say, for this computer, when somebody actually logged onto this computer, or I could say, no, I want to know what happened the last time somebody logged onto, and again, we could click on some other computer. I could do NY Mem. That should be enough to give me Mem 1. There you go. Show me what happens the last time somebody logged on to New York Mem 1. If I click Next, what user? And it's showing me the only users who have ever logged onto that computer are either the local administrator and then the Global Mantix administrator. So say, all right, show me what happened when the Global Mantix administrator logged on. Next, it just gives me a quick summary here of what I'm going to do. Click Next, and it is gathering the settings and creating a report. When I click Finish, I will have a report here. And if I go into the details, and I'm going to click on Show All. Look at this. When I scroll down through this, it shows me what settings were applied. Okay, that's what all this is. These are the settings that were applied. Looks a lot like when you looked at the settings on specific policies, right? But here's the one difference. And it's this column right here that says winning GPO. If you want to think of it like the GPOs are fighting to see who gets to have an effect on a particular user or computer. This is the GPO that won. I don't like to look at it as winning as much as I like to look at it as who was the last one to flip that switch. Okay, so the winning GPO tells you not just what setting was applied, but where it came from. Okay, so if we scroll down through here, we can see where and how things were done when the administrator logged on to New York Mem 1. Now that's past tense, and that's still pretty cool. But here's something I think is even cooler. Group policy modeling. Group policy modeling is a great way of doing a what-if scenario. Why should we wait until after somebody has logged on to a system to be able to go and see what has happened? I mean, that's great for if somebody's calling you up and saying, hey, you know what? I can't get to something I'm supposed to get to, and I'm not sure why. And you're thinking, well, to troubleshoot this, let's see what group policy is doing, right? That's what group policy results are great for, is it has already happened. Let's see why. Let's see what happened and why. Whereas with group policy modeling, the user didn't even have to log in yet. And this is also a great way to help with troubleshooting, because what happens if, let's take that same scenario, right? User calls you and says, I can't access the control panel and I don't know why. And so you go into group policy results and you run the wizard, and sure enough, it tells you, oh, you know what? User can't get to the control panel because there was a group policy object that prohibited access to the control panel, and that was the winning GPO. And then I make a change, right? I make the change that I think is good enough to make it that this user will now have access to the control panel. And before we had group policy modeling, what I would do is I would then tell the user, okay, I've made a change. Why don't you log off and log back in again, or maybe even tell them to reboot the computer as a whole. Or in some cases, you can actually do what's called a GP update, which is a way of updating the system with the new group policy settings. But regardless, you're telling the user to actually do something and then try again. And then you're waiting for the user to respond back to you and say, yes, I can now get into the control panel, or no, I still can't. And if the user says, no, I still can't, well, then you got to run the results again. And you can run the results because the user actually logged off and logged back in again, or you get new results. Where group policy modeling comes into great play is the user has called you, said, I can't get in. You made a change, and rather than tell the user, hey, why don't you try again? I can jump over here to group policy modeling, run this wizard, and there's all kinds of settings that you can do with this wizard. Okay, you can talk about where is the group policy being processed. Okay, so we'll say from any domain controller, right? Because unless we believe there's a specific domain controller that has a bad copy of the group policy object, we'll say any domain controller. And then here we're saying either what container is the user in computer in, or we could say no, specifically what happens if, and let's take John Smith. What happens when John Smith tries to log on to, I believe I have a client called Win8. Let's see here. Oh, typed in the wrong place. Win8, check names. That's what I want to do. There we go. Win8 client 1. Okay. Okay, what happens when John Smith tries to log on to Win8 client 1, right? We're going to say that John's the one who called and said that things aren't working right. Now, I could keep it as simple as that and just skip to the final page and run the report. But rather than skip, I will show you there are some other options you can put into play. You can say, well, let's see what would happen if there was a slow network connection, because there are slow link capabilities that you could, there's actually a setting in group policy to go ahead and say, I want you to do things differently if a slow link is detected. This really has a lot more to do with if you have a lot of big stuff that needs to go over the link, like software deployment. We can do loopback processing. Okay, if loopback processing is in place, this is another setting, and I'm going to show you this setting in just a few minutes. And I'm going to show you this setting actually in another lesson coming up here. If I click next, I can then enter new locations. So if I wanted to, I could simulate, hey, what if I took John Smith or Win8 client 1 and move them to a different container than where they currently exist? I could say, hey, what if John Smith was a member of different groups? Right now we can see John Smith is a member of the authenticated users, part of everyone, part of the domain users, and then also part of the sales users. All right, what if I want to tweak that a little bit? And then the computer security group, same thing. WMI filters, which is something else that I'm going to talk about coming up here in another lesson. Okay, we can implement those filters. And I think you're getting the idea here. I mean, there's quite a bit, so I'm just going to kind of scroll through here. Here we go. We get to the end, to the summary of selections. You have a lot of what-if options that you can do here. But the bottom line is that when I click on Next, it'll go through and it's processing the simulation. And when it's done with the simulation, once again, it's going to go ahead and if I click Show All, I can get all the details of what's going to happen now. Now, obviously, nothing's changed. This is going to look the same as if I did the results because I didn't go through and change anything. But this way, I can run this simulation. And then if the simulation says John Smith should now have access to the control panel, now I can tell John Smith, hey, go ahead and log off and log back in again. Or we can do a group policy update or reboot the computer. Again, it depends on what settings have been applied. And I will tell you, that's another important thing to understand when it comes to the processing of settings. Some settings can be updated through the use of a tool called GP Update. Okay, if I go ahead and click Start, open up a command prompt, I'm just going to type CMD, open up my command prompt here, and type GP Update. This is a command that's going to update the policy. Okay, so you could ask John Smith, if he was on the phone with you and you were helping him troubleshoot, you could say, hey, here's the instructions, go through, blah, 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 and run a GP update. Some group policy object settings will update just like that. Other ones require a little bit more of a process. And if it is user-based settings, then I will tell you that it requires logging off and logging back on again. Okay? That's important to understand that user-based settings are processed when a user logs on. Whereas if it is computer-based settings, you're going to need to ask the user to reboot, because computer-based settings are applied when a computer boots. Okay, so again, just to review, computer settings when the computer boots, user settings is when a user logs on, but GP update is a way of forcing the refresh of settings. But keep in mind that not all settings, and I don't have any specific rule to try to tell you which setting will or won't work with GP update. Sometimes you just try it. But GP update is a way of refreshing the settings, possibly without the need of logging back on or rebooting the computer. I will also tell you that there is a built-in refresh rate as well. Okay, and it's actually, believe it or not, a group policy setting that you can set on this. But it's not just that group policy options and settings will only happen on a login or a reboot. There is also a refresh cycle. But again, the only settings that are going to get refreshed on that refresh cycle are the same ones that would work with a manual GP update. Certain settings are going to always require a reboot or the user to log off and log back on. All right, so that is basically the idea behind the processing of group policy objects. All right, so that is the end of this lesson on implementing a group policy infrastructure. But again, keep in mind, we have a number of group policy lessons here. Okay, so I want to make sure that you continue on to the next lesson, which is working with group policy exceptions. And we're going to see in that lesson how, well, everything we just learned in this lesson, we can break some of those rules. So I'll see you in that next lesson.